this time, or if you all feel like you would like more clarification on that.
Yeah, let's see. Hello? Yeah.
No.
Just closer.
Just draw it in closer to you, I think.
Anyways, so this, in reading Chapter 5, in the methodology, it was mentioned that the relative importance of each attribute would be described, but then by the time you get to the impact analysis on covered fish and going to the summary table or figure, there was no evaluation of the relative importance of each one of those attributes that was being evaluated. So this kind of confounds a roll-up of the overall net effects. This is somewhat surprising to us because I know in the previous draft you did look at attempting to evaluate the relative importance of each attribute, or previously called stressor, and the certainty, uncertainty about that evaluation.
Are you referring to like a tabular summary or something like that? Or
yeah, previously I think you had a chart showing
right. I mean,
the relative importance.
At the moment it's there, but it's just in the text. So was that
right?
Okay.
So it's harder when you have 15 or so many stressors. It's hard to describe the relative importance of each one of those in a text. It would be helpful to have it in a tabular form.
So this next section, question 3 for us is, is the effects analysis reasonable and scientifically defensible? We have several points that fall under this, and so certainly strongly encourage the panel to weigh in on these specific concerns, and also for ICF for more clarification now. This is one of those places where I think some dialogue would certainly help us in terms of formulating the written report. For the terrestrial plants, the climate change variability assessment is probably adequate, but the net effects for species-specific fish is highly uncertain. And this comes down to, again, the sense that the effect for individual attributes for each fish species are probably reasonable, but the net effects resulting from these individual attributes is questionable, I guess is the word we dub. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but does anybody from the panel want to elaborate there? Okay. Yeah.
I just want to ask a question about that. That's obviously an area that we've been challenged with from the beginning, is how do you, quote unquote, roll up all of these individual attributes. So assuming we do get to a place where generally each individual attribute is assessed reasonably, which it sounds like maybe we're headed towards that direction, any input or advice or help in how you then would, what that integration then looks like at the end, that is certainly one of the biggest challenges we have with the fish net effects. And so we're very, very open and would, very much appreciate the input on what the process for that is, or how, what the procedure, how we go about doing that. It's very, very difficult to do.
I was also concerned about, unless you weight the attributes, you also can't determine the overall uncertainty, because you can imagine an attribute that has high importance, even one of them that has high uncertainty makes the whole program uncertain. On the other hand, you might have a lot of attributes that are very insignificant, but a lot of uncertainty has no effect on the overall assessment. Certainties don't average. Sometimes they multiply, but depending on your model, so unless we know the weight of the attributes and how certain are those individual components, we can't put the pieces together.
There's a feeling simplistic assumptions were incorporated into the delta passage model for application for net effects. With assumptions based on tag studies of large hatchery and migrating fish, and the assumption that shorter residence time for fish in the delta equates with higher survival. Again, I don't know if somebody wants to weigh in there.
Well, I mean, this was acknowledged. I don't want to say that wasn't acknowledged, but the thing is, there's it sort of carries through to the broader analysis of in delta survival, and it'd be really wise at least to balance the migrators with the foragers and sort of talk about the distinct differences in those, even though the mortality estimates or the survival estimates are less dependable and less available for those fry-type foragers. But I think you need to really sort of show the distinct difference amongst the stocks and those life history types, so that those then relate more to the restoration, because so much of your restoration actions are aimed towards the foragers, which you have least information on. So I'm not suggesting that you don't use those data, but I think it's important to show what little data there is to describe the other components.
This is probably a more general comment. It was felt that often in sort of looking at scenarios, there was a lack of consideration of variety of scenarios. So picking sort of more optimistic scenarios in modeling. So, for example, for food web models, looking at a pretty simple phytoplankton production model rather than sort of looking at a range of scenarios, bracketing results. It's another example, holding turbidity constant. So I think that was a general comment overall. There probably should have been more model bracketing with some of these ecosystem-based models. Let's see. Having a hard time with this one. So again, restoration of tidal wetlands, highly uncertain, at least extremely long periods of time, and yet restoration is assumed to be 100% perfect for meeting goals. And I don't know if somebody wants to weigh in more on that or let that stand.
I think one of the things we were talking about in this was that you make a flooded habitat. There are a lot of varieties of things that could happen. You could end up with clams in there, and those clams could eat up all your phytoplankton. So then, is it an effective habitat, or have you reached the goal that you wanted with that habitat? Or you may end up with SAV in there that's going to put you on a different trajectory. So is it 100% effective? When you put these in there, we don't know that they are actually going to produce what we want them to produce.
And also the timeline for which.
Oh yeah, it will take
over which that
a while for these things to establish.
And that's one thing that I think most of the sort of trajectories you saw, there's the PWA analysis of accretion rate and that sort of thing, which gave some idea of trajectories in terms of time development. But sort of some of the other analyses show trajectories which mostly appear to be acquisition of wetlands. And it really would be worthwhile sort of developing a small section on that consolidates, for instance, the PWA analysis with what do you expect to see in terms of trajectory of development to what you might consider a functioning tidal wetland. Because there's a lot of contingencies in depth and subsidence and sediment supply and everything like that. But there's where a couple scenarios or more would be really helpful in sort of bracketing what the time frame before those come online.
So again, we can appreciate the reason behind some of the lack of specificity in the location and configuration of ROAs, but it's certainly going to limit conclusions throughout many aspects of the effects analysis. For instance, the implications for connectivity and hydrodynamics, and for instance, this suggestion that by restoring large areas of tidal wetlands that we're going to produce a lot of organic matter subsidy for the food web. And that's very hard to evaluate when we have no sense of whether these wetlands will be hydrodynamically connected to the larger bay or delta. So for instance, Sassoon Marsh, if we're restoring areas of Sassoon Marsh, how much connectivity is there going to be with Grizzly Bay and Sassoon Bay to its south? Clifton Court Forebay, the physical changes need more evaluation before implementation. Just overall lack of documentation in the construction appendix on the impacts to fish, and also just a justification for this barrier, which comes at considerable cost. What are the benefits? There was some suggestion. It felt a bit like an afterthought. I don't know if folks want to.
I can go ahead in this one. So I was on expert science panel this fall where we saw documentation after documentation that Clifton Court Forebay is a big hotspot in several locations. And what we saw for what the changes were going to be was, first of all, you're going to put a wall in the middle of the Clifton Court Forebay as it is now. That will definitely, I should see in the construction appendix, a discussion of how that will affect the fish, first of all. There was also a suggestion that there won't be fish in the north part of that court. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And I don't really know if it's really necessary to have a barrier between the north and the south, whether they can just drain into one location. And I don't understand what the benefit for fish is for that barrier to be there. It may be, yes, that they need to expand the size of Clifton Court Forebay. That may be an engineering necessity in order to hold what they are anticipating that's coming down there. But these are details that are not, that I have not found yet in the documentation, something I'm really interested in knowing a little more of the background before before this phase 3, I had heard nothing about this part of this, and I feel like this is a place where there are going to be construction costs and something that needs to be thought about critically before it's put in place.
Okay, thanks. I still struggle a little bit with this contaminants appendix, looking at direct contaminant effects, and that's clearly stated in the appendix, and but the reader is then told to follow up in Appendix 5F. I felt that section really didn't deliver on those indirect effects, with the exception perhaps of microcystis. And just as an example, the herbicide use as part of Conservation Measure 13, I believe, there's some discussion about the impact to microcystis, but I wonder about those indirect food web effects and whether that could be explored a little bit more fully. I think the panel overall feels that the effects of changes to the conservation measures should include San Francisco Bay. The reality is there is connectivity, and the BDCP likely will have impacts downstream, particular loss of suspended sediments, and that impact to salt marsh in the face of sea level rise. And it sounds like that's something that's going to be more fully developed, or at least the justification for not including that. At this time, we feel like that should be included. Overall lack of synthesis and interacting effects and feedbacks. We sort of talked about this already, the restoration placement effects in terms of hydrodynamics. Again, the construction of restoration habitat and the impacts to things like microcystis, change in residence time, and how that will influence microcystis is discussed in part. We talked a little bit yesterday about temperature increases linked, or sort of driven by climate change. And I think that conclusion came from modeling of channel habitat, but of course doesn't include, newly constructed open water habitat that's going to have, different residence time and could potentially be a driver. And then things like nutrient dynamics and how that might influence microcystis. Microcystis, just as an example of some of these interacting effects and feedbacks. Presently, the food web analysis is interesting. The conceptual model looks pretty good, but the food web right now is partitioned into phytoplankton versus detritus, rather than really treated as an integrated system in the analysis. It looks like the conceptual model's attempting to get at that, but still, there's sort of a simple estimate of phytoplankton productivity, but we don't see equivalent estimates for contributions from other sources, submerged macrophytes, microalgae, and other detritus. Of course, the uncertainty in the bivalve grazing on primary production, that is being addressed to some extent. And then more complete development of this idea of timing of phytoplankton production versus detritus in the systems presently not considered. With respect to the effects analysis in terms of biological objectives from a table, I forget which table it is specifically, but recognizing that only a fraction of the objectives can be evaluated. And so this obviously highlights uncertainty in achieving of these objectives. And so these are from the document itself. I don't know if anybody wants to describe that any further, if that can stand on its own.
Yeah, this is just from a table from the beginning of Chapter 5, and I think we actually requested this last time, so it's nice that you put it in there, but it's just showing that for covered fish species anyways, only 11 or 28% of the biological objectives could be evaluated, in your opinion, and 38% of them were partially evaluated, but 33% were not evaluated at all, which is unfortunate because you think of the biological objectives, or it's where the project wants to go. You want to be able to achieve those objectives, and yet we don't have the information in the basin to evaluate at this point in time whether or not those objectives might be achieved. So therefore, this raises uncertainty in the overall effectiveness of the plan, and highlights the need for monitoring and adaptive management as the project continues.
So this is that place to put in a little break. We're about halfway through our initial comment.